We also we also want to share a disclaimer. This session is intended to be informational and educational and does not constitute legal, medical, or financial advice. Consult your legal, healthcare, or financial advisor for advice regarding your personal situation. AARP is not responsible for the consequences of any decisions or actions taken in reliance upon or as a result of the information provided during this event. Ooh, today is exciting. Today we are joined by anthropologist Dr. Elizabeth Keating. Elizabeth Keating is Emeritus Professor of Anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. In 2022, she was a Fulbright Scholar in the College of Business at the Technological University of Dublin. She has published 3 books and over 50 articles in academic journals and has given academic talks in 15 countries. She is a linguistic anthropologist by specialty and past editor of the Journal of Linguistic Anthropology. She has conducted research in Micronesia, Romania, Brazil, India, and the US and Ireland. She received her BA at the University of California, Berkeley, and her PhD at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. Her most recent book, The Essential Questions, Interview Your Family to Uncover Stories and Bridge Generations, published by Penguin Random House, has been featured on Apple News in Conversation and BBC Radio 4, as well as in The Atlantic, Time, and The New Yorker. Dr. Keating helps people uncover the unique memories of their parents and grandparents and create lasting connections in the process. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Keating. Dr. Keating, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's very exciting to be here and to have a chance to talk with all of you that are here about ways to make sure that your family stories don't get lost. So I'm just going to switch to the slide view so I can show you some slides that'll illustrate what I have to talk about today, probably make it a little bit easier to understand what my approach is all about. So a moment here to get us going. All right. Today I'm going to talk about things that are covered in this book, The Essential Questions, that Jacqueline was mentioning earlier. And so anything that you have questions about, you can check there in the book in case I don't go into it in enough depth to make it clear. The reason that I wrote the book is that my mother died. And I know a lot of you have had very tragic events in your families too. And what I discovered after my mother died when I was going through her things was how little I knew about her life, especially her early life before she became a mother and a wife. And it was amazing to me how I had rather pigeonholed her in the role of mother. And yet, behind that role was a person who had a very unique history in a unique time. And I wish I had asked her more about how she became who she was, which of course influenced who I became. And ironically, I had interviewed her a few years before she died, but I asked her the wrong questions, I realized afterwards. I asked her about the rest of the family. I didn't know some of our family because of my father's job. We moved around a lot and we moved away from all the family. So I had some curiosity about them. And that's what I focused on when I asked her these questions. Well, then I found out that that really wasn't what I wanted to know after she was gone. And I also found out that I'm not the only one. So this survey by Ancestry shows that a lot of people want to know more about their family history. And a lot of people feel that they really are in the dark about a very important topic, which is what happened in their family in past generations and even one generation before. And a whopping 72% want stories of when their grandparents were young. And this is really something that we hardly ever ask about because, of course, when you're with your grandparents, if you're a fortunate grandchild, the focus is usually on you, isn't it? So I realized that there were three flaws in my failed interviews with my mother, and I hadn't even thought about interviewing my grandparents. So the questions I asked my mother a couple of years before she died were based on information I already knew. So they were fragments she shared with me that I had people that I had questions about or things that happened that I had questions about. And as a result, she didn't tell me things that I had no idea about. And then, as I mentioned, I asked her about people in the family, and now I really just want to know about her. And then I got very trapped in our mother-daughter roles and the generational differences, which were huge between her generation and mine. And I couldn't really get out of my generational point of view. I found myself maybe being a little bit too judgmental about some of the things that she told me. And I wasn't able to step out of my frame of reference and take her perspective so that I could see what it would have been like to actually grow up in that time and the things that were going on in that time. Most of what we get from family histories are things like this, old-fashioned lists of grandparents born, married, died. It's not really very much information. There's a paucity of information really in these records. So what should I have asked? Well, here I am an anthropologist. I thought, well, I should have asked her the kinds of questions an anthropologist might ask if they want to find out about a person's life in another culture. Because when you think about it, the changes in America have been so vast that it's almost as if my mother and I grew up in different cultures. Certainly, a lot of cultural aspects were different. And so, in order to find out the right topics, I took my anthropology background and I interviewed people who grew up in the US, in the UK, in Hong Kong, Japan, Iceland, the Isle of Man, and other places. And I came up with these particular topics of anthropology and a couple of more. So space, cultural space around us, what was it like in the time that you grew up? How did you feel about time and the way time was passing? How did you fill up a day? And then what were social interactions like? What were the rules about interacting with people back then? And what were your rites of passage? What did the culture provide as far as how you became who you did become? And questions about identity, which made a lot more sense to Americans than people in some other places because we talk a lot about identity. And the body and adornment, which is always a fascinating aspect of human behavior, how we cloak ourselves and communicate things with our clothing and what it means. Belief systems, kinship and marriage, and material culture, the things that are important to us. So what happens when you ask an anthropological question? Well, what happened, first of all, before I talk about this interesting quote, when I was talking to all these people in various countries, I realized that I was finding out so many fascinating details about their lives in the past that I didn't want my students at the University of Texas, Austin to miss out on asking their grandparents questions. So as one of their semester assignments, I gave them certain anthropologically focused questions, the same as you'll find here and in the book, to ask their grandparents. So that was one of their assignments for the semester. And they absolutely loved the project, and their grandparents loved the project. And so here's a quote from one of the students. While I'd consider myself very close with my grandparents, he says, because they live very close by, he said he'd never had such a candid, in-depth conversation with them as I did with the interview. And he learned things about their lives and their relationship that he'd never heard before. And he was so glad that he had a chance to do this because later it their health was being impacted. But then, as we know, people can, strangely enough, remember a lot from their early life. So the students were really thrilled with this approach, and I knew that it was working very well. And here's another example. Another one said that because of the interview, he feels closer with his grandmother and more willing to share what's going on with his own life. And another student said they were surprised at how much their experiences were similar, even though they were very different in many ways as well. So what does it mean to be an anthropologist? Let me talk about my first anthropology fieldwork, which was in a very, very tiny island at the end of this arrow called Pohnpei. In fact, the size of the island is much smaller than the letters there on the world map. I went there from my graduate studies at UCLA, and I was very excited to be able to do what anthropologists do, which is go and spend some time in another culture. And what we do is we live with people and do everything day to day as they do. I lived with the family of a secondary chief, and we learn what life is from their perspective. You can see that Pohnpei is a very small island. It's only 10 miles wide. That's a big landmass for that part of the world. And you can see what it looks like. It's one of these islands with a coral reef, which makes it very safe and very ecologically robust. And there's me many, many years ago with my video camera, the big video cameras we had in those days, following some of the people that were helping me through the mangrove forests that fringe the island. And basically, what anthropologists are doing is trying to get the other person's point of view. So the idea is, if I'm talking to my mother, that I want to try to understand my mother's point of view as she was growing up in the time that she grew up. Now, anthropology is not a very old science. It wasn't until the 19th century that people started to realize that the accounts they were getting from missionaries and other travelers weren't really very complete. We needed to know a lot more about these other parts of the world and how they thought and what their housing was like and how did they think about time, were their social interactions like. And so another aspect of anthropology that's important to understand is the focus on the ordinary. Anthropologists do study rituals and ritual events, but when you think about it, it's not the ritual events that take up most of our lives. It's ordinary life. And we try to leave aside our own patterns of thinking and see the world through a new lens. We also try to withhold judgment and understand how each person makes sense of their world. Sorry, allergy season is all year for me. And that's what happens in Austin, Texas. So some of the topics here you can see in terms of space. How did I approach that topic? I wanted them to tell me about the home they grew up in. And I asked some follow-up questions too, which I'll talk a bit more in a moment. And time, how did you perceive time when you were a child? A lot of people tell me, well, time went really fast on the weekend, but really slow during the week. And then kinship and marriage, the making of a family. What were dating and courtship practices like when you were a teenager? So if we take the question of space and stories about the home you grew up in, space is really important when you think about it because our homes and our neighborhoods are repositories of family and cultural history. So if you want to understand someone's background, why do they think the way they do and why do they respond the way they do? If you understand something about their cultural history, you can learn a lot from how they describe their homes and their neighborhoods, which are very, very distinctive. And in Pohnpei, that very small island I was showing you, the whole of space was organized hierarchically because it was a very hierarchical system there. They thought that hierarchy was the way to preserve harmony in the community. Very different ideas from the ideas that I grew up with. A lot of details come out when you ask people about the house they grew up in. Here's someone that I interviewed in the Isle of Man between Ireland and the UK. She says, the first house I can remember is during the war. We shared a house with another family because my father and their father had been called up, gone to fight. We shared the house with them until the end of the war. I think it was a necessity on both sides because things were very difficult. I don't think it was very great for Mom, but for me and the two girls, the daughters, it was fine. And there were loads of children around, and we all got on very, very well. We were there 7 years. Mr. Donade, that was the one who owned the house, he was away for the entire time of the war. So in that description of someone's house, you don't just get the house, but you get a sense of the time and the place and World War II, which had such an impact on the British Isles part of the world where people were gone for a very long time to fight the war. And I'm going to show you another example here of the interesting ways that space can reveal something about a person's upbringing. All this person is asking is about the house they grew up in. And this is a selection from a podcast interview on Apple News. And you'll see how this person starts to talk about the past in interesting ways.
Do you mind just saying your full name and your date of birth and how old you are?
My full name is Angus Barney Hallowell. I was born on March 6, 1942, and I am 81 years old.
Very good. Okay, where were you born? That's my colleague, Lita Hallowell. She's one of the producers of this show. And when she read Elizabeth's book, she wanted to try out some of the questions with her own family. So she asked her dad, who goes by his middle name, Barney, if he would sit down with her for an interview. Can you tell me about the home you grew up in?
Well, my father was a teacher at Andover all my life. Andover is a private school in Massachusetts. So I lived in school housing at Andover, which was very nice. The thing I remember best about it was that we had radiators in those houses, big old-fashioned cast iron radiators, and they clung when they got hot and they would release steam. And the house was always very hot because of those radiators.
Okay. Where did you eat your meals? Did the family eat together?
Our family did eat supper together almost every night, usually in the dining room. You know, it was just in the time when people were getting televisions. And I remember we had our first television, I think might have been in the dining room. It was a huge box with a tiny little screen, and we'd sit on the floor and watch television. But we didn't watch television during meals. Usually we would sit down, but not that formally, and have supper. If my father was there, he would sit at a table and my mother at the other, and we kids would sit on the side. But yeah, we ate together, I think, quite a lot.
And what was like a typical meal?
My mother wasn't really a cook. I don't think she really liked cooking. And the other thing was that my parents always had cocktails. And, there was a lot of drinking in those days, which I hated. But we would just eat normal things, roast beef or hamburgers or, potatoes and yeah.
What did you hear when you woke up in the morning?
What did I hear? My mother always slept late, so I always went to school and she wasn't awake. I had to get myself up and get ready for school. The only thing I can say is I loved to listen to the radio in the morning when I got up. WBZ in Boston was the station. A guy named Carl DeSuze or Dave Maynard had the morning show, and I would listen to that. And I can remember listening to the news reports particularly about the Korean War and stuff like that.
Okay, last question. How would you compare your childhood home to the home you live in today?
Wow. As I reflect now, I realize how much of the time my father was away because he was not away from where we lived, but from the house because he was a teacher, which was very demanding. He was also a coach, and he was also the director of the theatrical productions at Andover. And so he really wasn't around a lot, except at night. My mother didn't work, and so she was more or less a constant presence. But again, she had her own life. So as kids, we had a lot of time on our own. But I always also say, life was a little bit easier then. We were more self-sufficient. We didn't have electronics. We didn't have television, really. We played outside. And I don't know. It seems like life was simpler then. Happier, I'm not sure I would say it was happier, but it was simpler. That's it.
That's it?
Yeah.
Thanks, Dad.
Yeah.
I love you.
There's a tremendous amount that comes through from just a question about describe the home you grew up in. And you might think there's going to be a description of a floor plan or a description of what type of house it was, but the richness of the details, and you get a sense of what every day was like for this boy growing up. And imagine getting yourself up for school every day by yourself, and imagine listening to the radio and remembering the radio station and the kinds of things that were on the radio. So these are the kinds of details that this question about space, I really found the question about space to be one of the richest questions of the anthropological topics that I picked, because of the way that space can evoke memories of the past and of childhood like almost nothing else. I developed this idea for the book and for these projects about finding out about family history based on the topics that I was mentioning before, the anthropological topics on space and time and social interaction and belief and so forth. I have a opening question at the beginning of each of the chapters that takes up these topics and explains a little bit about the topic anthropologically. I have a very broad opening question because I think a broad question makes possible the kind of description you just heard, which went all over the place, really, from technology of the television and the heating system to who was there for dinner and whether the mother really was a enthusiastic cook or not. And I think you get that kind of an answer if you have a really broad question. But then, of course, some people that I talked to would go on for 15 minutes in describing the home and answer a lot of the follow-up questions, but other people need a bit more prompting. So I provide some follow-up questions for every single anthropological topic. So, for example, how many bedrooms were there and where did you sleep? Where did you eat your meals, which you heard just a moment ago? And what was your favorite part of the home? What did the windows look out onto? What did you hear when you woke up in the morning, which again was a surprising answer in the last case, and the home heating. And then was the home used differently in different seasons? So in some parts of the world, it is used quite differently. And that can tell you a lot about the growing up experience. And then any stories about the home or surprising things that happened there? How is it different from the neighbors' homes? How did you get from home to school, and what did you see on the way? And then how does the neighborhood look today compared to then? How would you compare your childhood home to the home you lived in today? I think one of the most moving answers I heard was a fellow who said that he grew up on a very small farm in Texas in a very rudimentary home. And it was a far cry from the home he has in Houston now, which is in a upper middle class neighborhood, you might say. But he said he felt he had more space in this tiny home in Texas because of the space that included the outdoors. And at the same time, he said he's glad his grandchildren weren't growing up in that sort of poverty that he grew up in, but he was also able to see that he had a boyhood that had a lot of exploration in it that he could still value. Another question that's interesting to ask people is about kinship and marriage. So kinship, of course, is a big question in anthropology. It was probably one of the first questions that anthropologists got really interested in comparing societies about. I start out that topic by asking about dating and courtship practices. And some of my students, of course, University of Texas has a very diverse student body, and some of their parents grew up in places like Nepal and China. And so this question produced a lot of interesting answers, and sometimes they had to modify it a little bit. But sometimes the students said their grandparents would look at them like, you must be kidding. You want me to talk about that? But then they would talk about it, and they would have a very nice moment with their grandchildren about this very difficult time of life where you're choosing a life partner, and perhaps you don't even have all the information you need, and how are these questions and approached, and how are these big decisions made? And then, of course, families are not just about the families that are born, or the people that are born into them, but how they expand through marriage. And so there are a lot of interesting questions to be found in terms of understanding what it was like when parents or grandparents were children, or people in this audience were children compared to their own grandchildren. So, for example, my grandmother was the youngest of 13, and she only had two children, my mother and her brother, and my uncle didn't have any children at all. And so the change was from my mother, who had 12 aunts and uncles and innumerable cousins, to myself. I didn't have any cousins at all on my mother's side. So these are the vast changes that are going on between the generations that are really worth talking about to the younger generations, because otherwise they won't have any idea of what the challenges were like, and what the life patterns were like of the people whose beliefs and whose experiences made them who they are. Body adornment, as I said, is always a very interesting topic to look at, and a source of conflict between generations. I certainly had much conflict between my mother and I about what was considered to be appropriate things to wear in certain contexts. And this is one of my favorite stories that one of the students found when he decided to interview both of his grandparents together. It's really usually better to just interview one person at a time, so that you can get so people have enough time to talk. Really, it's surprising how much people have to say in these instances when they find someone who's really interested in hearing about their life. So he says, there's one story my grandpa interrupted my grandma to tell. When he was younger in early high school, he really wanted a pair of Levi jeans. He said he always got the cheap jeans for school when they went school shopping, but he really wanted a pair of nice Levi's for Christmas. He begged and mentioned he wanted them for Christmas, and that year he finally got them. And then he suddenly started laughing so hard. He said, I wore those jeans one glorious time and then put them in the wash. When my mom washed them, she cut off the little red Levi brand tag. I was so mad at the time because that little tag was the whole point. So his mom didn't see what the big deal was and just thought it was a new jean tag, like a price sticker. But of course, Levi jeans were really in at the time, and my grandpa was crushed. I thought the story was really funny when he was telling me because it seems something so relatable. The idea that kids put so much work into their image and the parents just don't understand. You wouldn't get it, Mom. Is timeless. So this is a wonderful story to illustrate how the getting family stories can help bridge the generations and create a new kind of relationship between yourselves and your grandparent and your grandchildren. So I just want to spend a little bit of time on tips on interviewing, because an interview is something a lot of people probably wouldn't have participated in, and some people are a bit unsettled by the idea, maybe, although people get into it quite easily, and it's never really an issue. But it helps to understand and not make all the mistakes that I've made in interviewing in the past, because of course I did a lot of interviewing as part of my anthropology work. So what you want to think about are how to make the interview really pleasant and really comfortable for the people that you want to interview about their growing up years. The Essential Questions talks mostly about growing up and teenage years. So I advocate having a few easy warm-up questions to start with. So if one of your grandchildren is interviewing you, and you have been the instigator, say, in getting one of these interviews done, it's really good to start with some easy questions. Where were you born? They might already know this, but it's nice to get it down in the beginning. Maybe you have something to add about that. And have you heard any stories about your birth? There's some really interesting answers to this question. People have all kinds of stories about the day they were born. Maybe they were born in Ireland, and the midwife who was on the way to their house to deliver them got stuck in a big rainstorm and windstorm and was late getting there. Also, how many brothers and sisters do you have? And where were you in the birth order? What's your favorite pastime? What's your favorite movie, TV show? What book have you read recently? So these are just questions that make a person feel comfortable about being interviewed and being the person who is in this sort of odd position where very often, the person who's asking the questions has all of the power, don't they? You sort of feel like you're maybe a little bit at their mercy to be put on the spot, but somehow, in some ways, to offset that, I have created pretty general questions to start with, but also to have some warm-up questions is a way to help ameliorate this a bit. And then when you're doing an interview or being interviewed as someone from an anthropological point of view, there are really three roles that the interviewer is going to take. Even though they might be a family member, they're going to be the one who manages the conversation, and then they're also going to be suspending their opinions. So to give the person that's being interviewed a level of trust that they can be frank and open and say things about things that happened in their past that they fully realize will be judged very differently nowadays than they would have been in the past. And it's very, very important to understand that people need to have a degree of comfort in how they're going to be judged by their family members, a degree of reassurance, let's say, that they're going to be judged on the basis of the time and place that these experiences took place, rather than in a 2020 hindsight fashion. And very often the people themselves will be providing some sort of commentary too on how things would be interpreted today. And let me give you an example. So in looking at one of the questions, which is on socialization and parenting styles. So what were your parents' parenting styles? A lot of people have said, well, we were expected to do what we were told, and we never talked to adults unless we were directly questioned. Now, that might seem odd to a young person today, because young people have been raised to question authority nowadays, and they might think that that reflected some sort of lack of identity or lack of confidence. But within that social period, that was how children were very often expected to behave. So that's an example of how, suspending belief and suspending judgment and trying to understand the period and the time and the history and what was going on there can be very, very interesting in terms of understanding not only our past, but how much things have changed in such a short time. A lot of times people will be nervous and they'll say, my life was too ordinary to be interesting to anyone. And I can guarantee you everyone's life is fascinating. I have heard people say their life was too ordinary, and I have not wanted them to stop talking because they told me so many interesting things. So reassure or be reassured that your life is definitely interesting as soon as you get to the details, because you are an eyewitness of a period of time and a place that no one else can say what you can about. Who to interview? You can interview lots of different family members. You can interview people of your own peer group or people of one peer group above you to understand something about their lives and to get a view of your family and the scope of your family. And then preparing for an interview, of course, you want to be comfortable and to be able to understand a little bit about the context that the person grew up in. So I advocate building common ground, keeping that in mind when you're talking to someone of a different generation or you're being interviewed by someone of a different generation. You have to provide a lot of common ground, and a lot of things will need to be explained that might seem common sense and very familiar to you. So sometimes it works for the younger person to do a little research about the period and place the person they're interviewing grew up in, so that they can understand some more and ask interesting follow-up questions. And then, of course, you want to record the interview because there's nothing more special than the human voice. And in that selection that I played for you, you can see that there is something very, very interesting in the intonation patterns and the way the person responds that you definitely want to capture. And also, many people nowadays, they like to listen to things rather than read them. Podcasts are getting more popular by the day, it seems. And so you want to take advantage of that. And there are many software programs that can help you to transcribe to make a written copy as well. Silences. You have to be able to tolerate silences when you're asking someone to recall something from their past. They need some time to transfer those visions of the past into words. And so be able to hold a 7-second silence when someone's getting ready to answer the question, and much better results will ensue from that. And of course, not interrupting. This is really hard when you get excited, not to interrupt. Creating a trusting atmosphere, showing appreciation, keep in mind the pacing and make it easy for people to answer the questions and details, details, details. That's the key, is to get as many details as possible. So I want to be able to leave enough time for questions. So I'll just finish up with this part here again to emphasize that people's language is very special. There are so many wonderful ways that Americans speak and that are different in different parts of America. And it's having a record of these different ways of speaking as a linguistic anthropologist, I think is a very, very important part of this whole project too. And then, of course, at the end, you want to be very, very appreciative of all of the time that people are taking with spending time, even though they really enjoy it, as you'll see. And then the transcribing part, because having a written copy can be very useful as well. Technology has a tendency to change. That's no surprise to anyone here. And sometimes the print record can survive in ways that the audio file is perhaps more vulnerable to technological change. So it's all about making connections. I hope that you will be inspired to either get your younger family members to interview you or to interview some of your own family members to find out some very key aspects of your family history.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Keating. Now let's answer some questions that came up. I saw several in the chat. Joyce, what questions are you seeing?
Oh, hi, Dr. Keating. This was extremely important information, and thank you so very much. I was writing down some points then, and of course, I need to start doing some of these things. I hadn't even thought about it. And I see some of our listeners did the same thing. Like right now, Paula is saying she's going to have a conversation with her daughter so we can get some information. So that's perfect. Thank you. Now, I have the starting question is, how useful is this if your parents and grandparents are all gone? What can they do? How can they start getting something?
Yes, that's an excellent question. I think that there may be still some family members left of the parents' peer group, and those people would be really good to interview. Also, other older people who are from that same period can be very, very interesting to interview. So I wasn't related to any of the people who I interviewed for when I was doing the research, but I learned a tremendous amount about those periods of time. I learned so much about World War II in the UK, for example. My husband is British, and I have family members through him over there. But I had no idea of the hardships they had there during the bombing of London and the bombing of other parts of the country, the naval bases and so forth, and how some people had lost 3 homes. They'd moved 3 successive times and gotten bombed out. And very, very tragic, tragic stories, which I had no idea about. And then I interviewed people in Ireland, and Ireland had gone through some terrible periods of poverty. You know, a lot of people emigrated to the United States during those times of terrific poverty when there was just no hope for the next generation. And that was very, very interesting to me, hearing about someone in China telling their grandchild about the first white person they ever saw, that their mother ran home to tell their mother, and she didn't believe them. She said, "Oh, it's a ghost or something." So these are really, really fascinating stories. So it doesn't have to be a family member to get a lot out of it. In fact, I think some people are advocating, how to get a good conversation going with someone that you don't know. We often just rely on subtleties and, there's common phrases about the weather and such. And, it can be interesting to ask people these pretty innocuous questions about what was the house like or the apartment like that you grew up in? And it might have been the 14th floor where the elevator never worked. And it's
Yeah.
all kinds of fascinating details about the diversity of experience and the challenges that people have overcome. I think at the end of each semester, when my students were sharing a little bit with the rest of the class of what they found, the poverty in Texas several generations ago, I had really not appreciated. And you really can um, gain a sense of the challenges and hardships of people, and you gain a kind of awe for them and the strength that they have shown.
Thank you so much. And then you brought up actually one of my next questions. You're talking about the World War bombings and et cetera. And this other person was talking about trauma. What about trauma stories? How do I don't know how to share those things with my kids and grown kids. And then should I do it? And then you kind of mentioned a little bit about that again.
Yes, what I found is that those kinds of um, accounts, those first person accounts that are so powerful, sometimes when they're told with the context of a place, a particular place or a particular time, they can have a lot of power. So one of my students told me about her Cajun grandmother, for example, who was telling her that they always had to go to the back of the restaurant and get their food from the window because they weren't allowed to go around the front and enter the restaurant and sit down. And this was part of the description of the neighborhood and the home you grew up in. And I think that often trauma it's integral. It's not just one incident. It seeps into every aspect of a person's life, that kind of discrimination. She said when after the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act, she said, I could go anywhere and it was so freeing. So I think sometimes we think of trauma as just one story or one having a kind of coherence to it in a narrative. But I think that one of the ways that it can come out is even in these everyday accounts, and the everydayness of it is what is so powerful to me, that these kind of affronts every single day um, can be very communicative. Another thing I would say about that is I've had people cry when one fellow I was interviewing, when he was talking about his mother. And I think it's very, very moving when someone's emotion is still so powerful that a recollection, a memory can bring that same motion to experience. And so I think that's something that should be honored, just sitting with that for a moment and letting that person have that moment of emotion. But I think that trauma is a very difficult one. My father never talked about World War II. He was in World War II in Europe, and he never even mentioned it. Um, Even if you would ask him, he just didn't want to talk about it. And I think that that's certainly part of a lot of that's certainly people's decision that they may not want to talk about it. Um,
Mhm.
so um, I think people have a lot to say, and I wouldn't want anyone not to say what they have to say because the history is such a vital part of becoming better and becoming more wise. It took me a long time in my life to recognize this, I have to say. But I think all of us benefit from not forgetting.
Wow, thank you so much. And this is There's so many other questions that are in here. It looks like you're going to have to come back again. But just to kind of do a quick wrap up or a summary, if you can, what about capturing memories now, like in this day and age, for our grandchildren and our children? And I don't want to say everybody on here is old, but how can we do that? I know we're up in age, but what's a good tip, like from right now moving forward? If you can kind of answer that in a couple of seconds.
I would say start recording things now. I'm working on a book right now for Penguin that is going to address some of this, I hope, which is more focused on an individual. In other words, writing your own life story.
Yeah. Okay.
I think it's incredibly important, and I think that not to forget the ordinary things. Don't forget to talk about the ordinary things because they seem very ordinary, but they're the stuff of life, they're what makes life worth living. And so I would say, take a few minutes every day and just record some memories or write down some memories. And when you take pictures, and it's very hard now with digital pictures to
Yeah.
create a caption for the picture,
I know
I'm afraid that, a lot of the pictures that I found that my mother had, I didn't have any way of knowing who those people
who
were.
those people are. I know the same thing with me. I don't know. I take
Yeah.
pictures a lot, but if you don't remember to put down the date, where you were, and who's in the pictures.
Yes. And I hope that people will write down what they know about their family too, because there's sometimes very little about previous generations. So a lot of times when you're asking about their own home life or the home they grew up in, you get a lot about previous generations too. That's useful. So if people feel shy about writing about themselves, just try writing everything you know about your grandparents and your uncles and aunts, and even that will be very special for your family.
Wow, thank you so very much. Unfortunately, we have to bring it to a close, but I really think you need to come back again. So back to you, Jacqueline.
Thank you, Joyce. Excuse me. And thank you, Dr. Keating. If you look at the comments, you can see that everybody was saying very interesting, a lot of good information. So thank you very much.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So join us next month for Tea and Coffee Tuesday on July 14th for our next program on solo living, what the research says. Join Lona Choi Alum, Senior Research Advisor at AARP, for a conversation exploring AARP's latest research on solo agers, adult ages 50 plus who live alone without a spouse or children. This session will highlight key findings from the study, including the balance of independence and fulfillment many solo agers experience, alongside growing concerns about aging, health, financial security, and long-term planning. And if you would like to view previous programs or learn more about the Tea and Coffee Tuesday monthly series, check out the link that has been put in the chat. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Keating, for today's excellent presentation. And thank you to our Tea and Coffee Tuesday volunteers, Sarita, Vince, Haresh, Joyce, as well as our AARP staff. And of course, thank all of you for showing up this morning and joining us. We hope you've enjoyed today's presentation. I am your AARP volunteer host, Jacqueline Cole. This concludes today's program. Thank you and have a great rest of the day and have an awesome weekend. This concludes our program.